Okay, so what's right in copyright and permissions, a publisher's perspective? First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Sam Wilkinson. I've been working in the academic publishing industry for the last 6.5 years. And in my time, I've had the opportunity to be involved with applying for rights and permissions on behalf of authors, and also giving authors advice on how to apply themselves. So in my time, I've had a bit of experience, and I've used that experience to inform my presentation today to try and answer some of the basic questions that you might have or your clients might have if you're working with them. So what I'm going to cover today in the presentation is: what is copyright? Who holds copyright? When do you need permissions? What permissions are and how you apply. Information a little bit about the corporate reuse permissions requests that we have at Taylor & Francis, and also a few tips that I've picked up that might be useful for medical writers. So first of all, what is copyright? According to the Copyright Licensing Agency, copyright is one of the main types of intellectual property. It allows the copyright owner to protect against others copying or reproducing their work. The main works currently protected by copyright in the UK include original literary works, original dramatic works, original music works, films and broadcasts, but that's not the limit to the list. And just like any other asset, copyright is something that can be transferred or sold to another party. So in an academic publishing setting, authors are requested by the publisher to transfer copyright for their original work, meaning the publisher will have the copyright over that work. Typically, copyright is transferred late in the publication process, so once a manuscript or a book has been accepted for publication, but before the final version of record is published. And once the copyright has been transferred to the publisher, they have the right to determine if the content is reused and how it's reused and how much it will cost to reuse it. There are ways in which copyright can stay with the author of a manuscript, and that is through the use of a Creative Commons license, and publishing a manuscript is open access. So how do you find out who owns copyright? Usually finding out who owns copyright should be fairly straightforward. You can look at a PDF of a published article or a book chapter, or the paper copy if you have that, and there should be a copyright line included. On this slide I've included an example of what the Taylor & Francis copyright line looks like on anything that we have copyright for. And this copyright line will just tell you who has the copyright of the manuscript or the paper, and whether the copyright hold lies with the publisher or with the author. So as I previously mentioned, the authors can retain copyright if they've published under a Creative Commons license. In examples where you don't have full access to a manuscript, there are different ways that you can find out whether a publisher or a different party owns the copyright to a piece of work. I would generally direct you to the rights and permissions, or the copyright or the permissions link that should be on the journal article page. And by clicking through this, it will either take you to information from the publisher or to a third party, for example, RightsLink or Copyright Clearance Centre. And this is where you can submit your requests for permissions, and this should direct you as to whether the publisher holds the copyright for the work, or who you need to direct your queries to. If you're still unsure about who owns the copyright for the manuscript, contact the permissions team at the publisher. They'll be able to assist you with your query. So when do you need permission? There are lots of examples of where you need permission, where you don't need permission. So there are many instances where it's very clear cut. For example, if you wish to reuse a figure or a table exactly as it was previously published in a new work, then you'll need to obtain a license to reuse that unless it's been published under an open access license. This is a very standard query that publishers are very used to receiving, and it's something that can be addressed very quickly and efficiently. Other instances where you would need to obtain permission is if you've decided to adapt a figure. So an adaptation of a figure is where you've decided to add new information or take information away from a figure that's already been published. Adaptations aren't always covered by a standard permissions license, and each publisher generally has its own stance on whether they allow you to adapt a figure or not. So I would always recommend contacting the permissions team for that particular query if you know a figure's been adapted. And they'll be able to advise you how to proceed and whether they can provide you with a specific license. You would also need to obtain a license if you wanted to reuse a figure in a commercial setting, because a commercial reuse license allows you to do different things with the content that you're applying for permission for. There are examples where you also will not necessarily need permission. So if you wanted to use data, for example, you would be able to use that and manipulate it into new figures if you were summarising. For example, if you were doing a meta-analysis of lots of research, you might want to incorporate that data all into one source. And also when you're redrawing figures, redrawn figures are classed as new works. Sometimes it's not always clear whether a figure has been redrawn or whether a figure has been adapted. So I'd always try and clarify your position on that first. And if you're not sure, then also address this query to your publisher. A potential grey area that sometimes arises, depending on the publisher, is when an author wishes to reuse their own work. So if you wanted to just reuse a figure from your previous publication in a new publication, this generally is fine. Publishers most often won't charge you for this, but they might ask you to apply through RightsLink or their permissions team to have a license to say that you can reuse it. When authors try and modify or adapt their previously published work in new work, this is something I would always address a query to your publisher about, because some publishers will allow you to adapt your own work without a license, some will, so it's a bit of a contentious point that you might just need to clarify. So once you know that you need to get permission, how do you apply? So permissions is really a term that we use about the application for a license to reuse content. And as I've mentioned previously, you can apply through RightsLink or Copyright Clearance Centre or directly through your publisher. Some publishers use these third-party sites, others don't. And the type of reuse will determine the cost of how much it will cost of obtaining a license. I'm going to outline in this slide just the RightsLink application process. However, the information that RightsLink request is also the information that Copyright Clearance Centre will request, and also what a publisher will request if you're applying directly to them. So step one is selecting the type of reuse for your content. So this would be if you wanted to reuse a figure in a journal article or reuse a figure in a book chapter, for example. And once you've selected this option on RightsLink, the page will refresh and give you another set of questions, which is step two. So step two allows you to generate a quote, basically, for your permissions request. And it will also be an area where they ask you for more information about your new work. So you'll be asked for how many figures you wish to reuse in your new work, the circulation of your new work, and some of these questions might be something that you just don't know the answer to. So I'd always recommend just contacting your publisher, as they'll be able to advise you on the circulation. The circulation is usually an estimate, because now that views are predominantly online. It used to be based on subscription figures, but most articles are viewed online rather than in an actual paper copy of the journal. So they'll be able to help you with that information. Once you've filled in that whole slide of information, you will be able to generate a cost for your permissions. There are some examples where your permissions cost will be free. So if you were a publisher applying to another publisher and they're part of the STM signatory bodies, then your permissions request is free of charge, providing you're not asking for more than a small excerpt of text or a limited number of figures. And this is just an agreement. The STM signatory publishers have an agreement among themselves to use a small amount of content on a gratis basis. But if you exceed that limit, then you will often be charged. Another example where you may not be charged for your permissions request is if you're an author applying to reuse your own content in a new work. An example where you potentially would not be able to generate a quote is if you wanted to use a figure in a commercial reuse setting, because each commercial reuse and quote is done on a case-by-case basis depending on how you wanted to use that content. So between steps 2 and 3 on RightsLink, you'll be prompted to log into your account. If you don't have an account with RightsLink, you can also create one at this step without losing your information that you've already inputted. And then once you've logged in, you'll come to step 3. So this is providing information about your article. So this will be the title of your new work, where you intend to publish it, how many pages it's likely to be published, and also when it's likely to be published. So the last kind of 2 questions about when it's likely to be published and how many pages, you may not be able to answer yourself. So I'd always recommend just speaking to the editorial team that you're working with, or with the publisher themselves, because they'll be able to advise you on those numbers. The final step, you'll be asked to provide information about the original figure that you wanted to reuse, and also prompted to add in an order reference number. It's not something that you have to include, but I would always recommend including if you're applying for multiple figure permissions, or if you are applying on behalf of multiple manuscripts, because it just helps you keep track of the licenses that you've obtained, because the reference numbers are included on your license as well. Once all that information has been provided, you're able to submit your request. If your request is a standard one, then through RightsLink, you're usually able to generate your permissions license straight away. If it's a bespoke request and it needs to go to the publisher, then it might take a little bit more time. But RightsLink will direct those queries to the publisher's rights and permissions team, and they'll be able to take your query forward. So a little bit just about the corporate permissions requests that we have at Taylor & Francis. So a corporate use permission is when a commercial entity wants to use some content from a journal article to either use it within a commercial organisation, or they wish to promote something that their company was a part of. At Taylor & Francis, we also quite often get presentation requests when companies or corporate clients are presenting their work at conferences. The corporate permissions licenses that we have at Taylor & Francis are slightly different to an academic license, as it enables the requester to use it within a commercial organisation or in a commercial way, whereas an academic license doesn't give you the authority to do that. Corporate requests at Taylor & Francis are always handled on a case-by-case basis, depending on how the client would like to use that material. And they're handled by our in-house permissions team. We actually have a dedicated member of staff that just does our corporate use permissions requests. And the cost of those is always determined by the type of reuse rather than the person applying. So most commercial customers generally know what they want from their permissions request. But the common query that we often have is about the timeline that it takes to obtain a license. So once a submission request has been received to our team, you'll be sent a list of questions if you've not already answered them through RightsLink. Once you've answered all those questions about how you'd like to reuse content, we'll be able to check that we have the copyright for that content, most importantly, and also we'll be able to check all the information that you've provided and hopefully generate a quote. Once a quote is issued, we send that to the client and they'll be able to review it and make sure that they're happy with it. Providing that they're happy with that quote, we'll be able to issue an order confirmation form and a license for the client to sign. And once that's been sent back to us, they'll be issued with an invoice for the cost of that license. So the timeline can be a little bit affected by the client and how quickly the paperwork's filled out and sent back to us. But because we have a dedicated member of staff, we're able to process these quite quickly. So the final slide that I have is just a few tips that I've picked up along the way that I would use for medical writers and myself and my team. So the first thing I would always say is make sure you know whether a figure or a table is original or whether it's been previously published or adapted. If you want to reuse an adapted figure in your work, permissions can sometimes get a bit complicated because you might need to obtain permission from the first publisher and the second publisher. It gets very complex. Once you've just worked out whether the figure's original, whether you actually need to apply for permission, you can apply for permission as soon as possible. If your request is a bespoke one, then sometimes it takes a while to generate that, depending on who the publisher is and the type of reuse that you have for that content. And if you can apply before you submit a manuscript, it will speed up the publication process of your paper very significantly. When you're applying for permission, try and gather the information for that permissions request prior to your application, as this will mean that you can put your permissions request straight through rather than going backwards and forwards to the publisher all the time. And if you don't know the answer to a question or you're unsure of how to proceed, then I would always contact the editorial office that you're working with, or the permissions team of the publisher that you're working with, or the previous publisher of that original work, as they'll be happy to assist you on how to apply or what you need to cover you. So thank you very much. That was just a brief snapshot into copyright and permissions. I'm happy for you to contact me at any point if you have any questions about what I've spoken about today. And I've included just some additional resources that you can review about what copyright is, open access licenses, the STM Association, which will tell you about who's an STM signatory publisher, and also about the Taylor & Francis Rights and Permissions team. So thanks very much.